My mistake.
That's all
Just
good.
trying to go very quickly. Council. Okay. In your hands, you.
Thank you
I've got
so
you down there for
much.
10 minutes, so.
Tēnā koutou katoa, I'm Sally King. I am the Executive Director of the New Zealand Medicinal Cannabis Council. I think Hayley was quite a useful foil for my conversation, and I do want to put a face to medicinal cannabis users in New Zealand. Just imagine, if you will, you have finished a chemo treatment on Friday, and on Monday you're taking your non-driving mum and your toddler, mum to the airport, your toddler to daycare, and you're outside of Pukekawa and you get stopped for a random drug testing moment. The night before, you had taken a prescribed medical cannabis dose and you test positive, and you test positive twice. And what happens then is you are immediately forbidden to drive and your keys are taken away. And those keys are away for 12 hours. So you followed your doctor's instructions to the letter. There's no impairment. You certainly wouldn't be driving your mother and your toddler if there was. It's pretty presumptive of the state to think they know better than the doctors and indeed yourself as to whether or not you're impaired. A 12-hour ban on driving without proof of impairment is a very significant penalty. The impact of this penalty on lives and livelihoods is barely mentioned in the cost-benefit analysis I have read. And it's damned important. It's very costly to you, your toddler, your mum, the friend who has to come and pick you up, who closes her shop so that she can get your mum to the airport. To say nothing of the embarrassment, the stress, and the injustice. Taking your keys, if you are impaired, is entirely justified. But it's an inexcusable intrusion on your day if you're not. And I think we've underplayed it in this particular conversation, the impact of the removal of your capacity to drive for 12 hours when taking a legal prescription. Now, this isn't only true for medicinal cannabis users, it's true for everybody taking prescription medicine in accordance with their doctor's advice. That's to say nothing of the fact that we know that there's a high random drug testing undertaken somewhere between 2.5, if we do 50,000 tests, 2.5 to 5,000 people will be subject to this intrusion on their lives because of the false positives. And a punitive 12-hour driving ban imposed on patients who are taking medication as they are instructed by their prescriber impacts reputation, it impacts livelihoods, it impacts childcare, it impacts insurance, it impacts employment, is particularly discriminatory to the disabled because they don't have other transport alternatives, and to those who live in rural areas. The tests don't detect impairment, they detect presence. We've heard about that quite a lot. And medicinal cannabis patients are not trying to get high, they're just wanting to function. We would ask that the tests include not just 2 tests for saliva and evidence. One test for saliva would take you to a test for a compulsory impairment test, a CIT perhaps, to genuinely evidence that there is impairment. But for those medicinal cannabis patients who are taking their medication as prescribed, there has to be a robust defence in law that removes this 12-hour penalty for the fair use of their medicines as they are prescribed by their doctor. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Sally. We've got about 5 and a bit minutes, so questions, colleagues, if there are any. So look, if I'll kick one off anyway. It's just that, so what you're suggesting is a different test pathway. So you're not saying there's not an issue, but really what you're trying to do is avoid the false positive
I am.
outcomes.
I'm
Okay.
proposing.
So you're suggesting a different test pathway. Can you just walk us through that pathway that you're suggesting and what value oral tests might have in that pathway?
What I'm proposing is that if a medicinal cannabis patient is in a random drug testing environment, that they do have a first saliva test. If that should prove to be that there is evidence of use of medicinal cannabis or indeed any of the other 19 prescription medicines that will be brought up on a testing screen, that person then undertakes a compared or some kind of field sobriety test. It would have to be probably a reduced model because it's quite a long test, but an opportunity for there to be evidence that there is indeed impairment before there is infringement notice or a 12-hour ban on driving.
So effectively, it's a pathway to a CIT test.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing that we should bear in mind here is that, you know, the CIT, no one wants to see any further impairment, impaired driving. Certainly not medicinal cannabis users.
So just before I go to Cam, so you're still seeing value in the oral test, but
Yep.
only as a
Screening mechanism.
gateway, screening mechanism. Okay.
I am.
And then is there any value in having a lab test as part of all of that process?
Certainly.
Yeah.
If there is impairment, they shouldn't be driving.
Okay. Right. Thanks. Cam.
Hey, yeah, thank you. I just picked up on something you said, a robust defence in law. How would you see an exemption, perhaps, scheme working, like without muddying the waters, like say something on the back of a licence or a certificate from a doctor that you carry around with you? What are you envisioning there?
I'm envisaging that the police would be able to ask for evidence of a valid prescription. The method that Hayley suggested, which is on a phone, rather than carrying around a medicine, probably would work. That the police would take that into consideration, and that if they didn't feel there was any impairment, but it had shown up in the test that there might be, if they felt there was impairment, then clearly a CIT or a field sobriety test would be entirely appropriate. But if not, they should be able to go on their way.
So, I mean, it doesn't. I mean, just sounds great, but it doesn't sound super robust. You're saying just if you can show your prescription, then you don't need to be tested. Is that what I'm hearing?
No.
Okay.
I'm saying if you can show your prescription and you don't appear to be impaired, then the police will give you the benefit of the doubt that you are taking your medication accurately and correctly, and let you go on your way. If by some chance you look impaired, then they should undertake a test that will permit them to see that there is indeed impairment rather than evidence of use.
Okay. Thank you.
Because, so the last part of that, sorry, I was just sorting out the proceeds from here on. But the part of that there is if you say, well, here's my prescription, you're saying it's got to be taken on faith that you've actually met the terms of the prescription. Otherwise, you haven't driven within 6 hours, for example. Yeah.
I think
But
you
if
can
you look
reasonably.
impaired, then you go, hang on, I'm still going to test you.
Well, that's right.
Yeah.
And I mean, we have 600,000 people or more in New Zealand taking prescription medicines that are impairing. Are we taking the view that none of those people are capable of following their doctor's instructions?
Yeah. Right. That's very helpful. Any other questions, team? No, Sally, thank you very much. Really
Thank you.
appreciate that.
That was an interesting submission. It's a bit in all sorts of different directions. I mean, one thing I definitely can say is when I last got breath tested, before they did my breath test, they had to scan my driver's license to check if I had a zero alcohol limit or not. Something like that could also be logged onto that same system. You know, because then you've got the verification that can be checked with that. It's not like, you know, the prescription pad sitting in the car. You know, there are tools out there.
Yeah, I mean, I quite like some of what she said. You know, the idea of like having something on your phone to say, hey, I have a legal prescription. It's not impairing my ability to drive. You know, do we need to go ahead with tests? You know, whereas like, oh, go ahead, Rachel.
How do you prevent people faking them?
That is an excellent question.
Point.
That's an excellent question, and that is something that will definitely need to be debated, and something I will need to do some research into for sure. But yes, that is a really good question.
COVID vaccination passes. That was a classic example of, well, what happens if someone was using someone else's pass on the phone?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And that was something. So we've had a system in place now. I actually, thank goodness, I hadn't had times where I had to show both my IDs to get it, but there were people who are known for doing that, going through, showing up with other people's vaccination passes when they weren't vaccinated to get around the system. And if you weren't going to a licensed bar, you weren't likely to be asked to see your an ID. So that would be, it's like, well, what steps do you sit and do it? But like, as I said before, you know, you could scan the driver's license, and that could actually be verified, that information, along with the, because I do know certain prescriptions, they do database them with your NHI number, because I know one of the prescriptions I get, because it's got a special authority number, it's got to say exactly which doctor prescribes it, which pharmacy picks it up, which pharmacy I pick it up from. Yeah,
I think it's a really pragmatic idea to have something like that to prevent it elevating to courts, so that officers can use their discretion and apply some kind of impairment test. But I don't agree with this. She's proposing the CIT field test, because we know they don't work for cannabis. We had a few submissions from MedPot users, and they are told with their prescription that they may not be safe to drive for 6 hours, which is the exact window that oral fluid will catch someone who is a regular user. It could be up to 6 hours. Most people, if they're recreational and they just, you know, have a weekend joint, they won't show positive on oral fluid after 2 to 3 hours, but it is 6 hours for regular users. Very few would go positive on an oral test after 6 hours. But with the CIT, 60% of people who are quite impaired on cannabis on a driving simulator can pass a standardised field test. So that's just not a go. But some of the submitters brought up a new technology, and I'm trying to remember what it was called. Alertometer. I think it was alertometer. It was actually brought up in the normal submission. One of the rare things that they've said that I've actually liked, because I disagree with most of their submissions. But there is something called an alertometer, which I looked it up, and it actually looks like it's pretty good. I don't think it's been applied in a roadside enforcement framework before. But if that was to be used for medical users, I think that would be quite innovative and useful for us. And it's something like a 60-second test. But the question with some of these things is that you may need to have a baseline from when the person was sober. So I don't know whether you need that with this alertometer thing or not. It's being used in workplaces, which is a good endorsement. It's quite widely used, apparently. There was another app that they were talking about that I looked into that didn't sound very good, called the Druid app, because you needed a baseline, and it had some issues. But I think she's going in the right direction. We do need some protection for medical users. They're more likely to have a bit of a tolerance and be able to drive safely because they're used to using. And also, you know, they're far better to be having their medications when it's being taken for a proper reason, and they're not taking it to get high. It's not taking it to get high, and they don't have much THC, active THC, in the script anyway. So, like, they're not really a concern. They're someone that we should be supporting and removing any fear of this law, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, at least, you know, they're not a threat to other drivers. That's the priority here, is getting and a lot of medicinal cannabis users, they're not driving because
I'm an ex-nurse and I used to administer hashish and medical cannabis to people when I was overseas, working overseas before it was legalised here. And they're not driving. I mean, they're people with MS and stuff that are bedbound, a lot of them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or they're not, or they're probably medically not cleared to drive. And I mean,
No.
I know that because I personally, because I've got an HT, I have to go through tests. And the one I always love about is the eyesight test. Because if you get a truck driver's medical, you don't have to do this hideous eyesight test at the AA or the VTNZ.
I feel like the committee was sympathetic to those views, the medical cannabis users. So they may actually achieve something with their submissions. Fingers crossed.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what's in the select committee report.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Yeah, okay, so it sounds like there's a lot of room here for innovation and adaptation. Like things can be improved, different ideas can be brought to the table. That's a good thing.
Yeah.
okay.
Comes down to the advisors, though. It comes down to the advisors because they're rushing legislation through this government.
Yes.
So are they going to just pause and look for these nice little bells and whistles, or are they just going to rush, you know? That's
Yeah, that's what
Are they going to have Uncle Andy go, please watch this submission like we've just done again, you know, or something like that?
I think a lot of the time this stuff is so complicated that the MPs just tune out. They say to the policy advisors, what do you think? And the policy advisors are new to this. I've seen in my time about 4 changes of guard with new policy advisors. So, you know, you get them honed up and then they leave and they move somewhere else. And then you've got a new lot that are completely green. And then they're advising the MPs. And it's just a bit of a, I don't know what you call it, chaos, really.
Well, especially when things keep chopping and changing often. I mean, you know, put it this way. Maybe they need to have someone like Selwyn Toogood, who was on It's in the Bag from running the show from when it first went on radio 1954 until 1987. You know, will they end up having a policy advisor like that? I mean, you know.
It's a bit like that, yeah.
Yeah, it's I think the US version of that, his name was called Dr. Fauci. Because he was like a policy advisor back before Ronald Reagan was president. Yeah. I'm just trying to think of. I'm just looking on there of on. Going on there.
Can I hold up while you're thinking? Can I just hold up something? Because all of this is unbalanced, I'll admit it to the people that complain, because we haven't got a big, strong cannabis advocate here. But I think we're just trying to get an overview of the select committee here, and this is who you've got. So there were a few submissions that were incorrect, saying that the random testing hasn't saved lives over there. I just want to hold this bit of paper up, which is the Auditor General's report on how it's been working and what they think ramping up their tests can do. So I don't know.
I'll just maximise your screen.
Oh, it's upside down.
Oh, heck, your camera's a bit blurry. That's the only thing. So it's not showing details in there. But
never mind. I'll just read it out. It just says that that between 2013 and 2014, the Victorian test prevented 33 fatal crashes a year, which is more lives because fatal crashes often take more than one life. 80 serious injury crashes a year. And that they recommended that by ramping it up with an extra 100,000 tests, that will save an additional 52 serious injury crashes and 21 fatal injury crashes. So this is what the reviews are saying. They're not saying that the policies have failed. They say they're working, but there's not enough deterrence because there's not enough tests being done. There are tiny fraction of the amount of breathalyzer alcohol checks that are done, and you have to have that certainty that there's a risk of being pinged to actually achieve any behaviour change.
In Australia, don't they do every time I've watched the Australian cop shows, whenever they've done a drug test, the person's outside the vehicle. They're never in the vehicle to do the drug test.
I don't know why.
Yeah, I don't know. There's something in there. Like, is the testing itself like breath test? You can basically put a line of cars up there, sit down there, breathalyze. You know, you can sit down there. You can have 30 seconds, and if you have 4 breathalyzers, you have 4 cars on the road, you get 4 cars through the queue. But when it comes, but isn't it required to test them?
Yeah, it does take 5 minutes. So perhaps I just think maybe they're taking the opportunity to try and look at whether they're looking physically impaired when they get them out of the car. They might just be using that chance to give them a once over. I don't know. I really don't know the reason, but maybe people just want to stretch their legs if they're going to be parked for 5 minutes.
That other aspect.
5 minutes for a negative test, obviously longer if it's going to lead to the second test. And somebody on the questions asked why, if someone's going to fail a field test, what's the point of doing a confirming test? That's to confirm that it's not a false positive. They haven't tested positive for methamphetamine and then failed a field test because they've taken cough mixture. So the second test will confirm, it's a lab test of oral fluid that will confirm that the initial screening test was correct.
And the same thing is done with rapid HIV tests, that if you get a positive, you tend to, on the RAT test, you tend to get a second test done before they would sit there and refer it to the next stage, which is a blood test, which I do know that, considering up until I went on PrEP, that was how I did my HIV test, because I hate needles. So, I definitely know that HIV test, and with COVID, which used a newer version, the same type of test, but adapted for a different compound, they recommended if you had a positive test, you do a second test to make sure that you had 2 positives before you had it confirmed as a positive diagnosis. Which I do know that, because I've twice been in the situation of a household where the house got COVID, but I managed to avoid it. Don't ask me why. I still don't know why, and on both occasions I was daily testing. So, yeah.
I don't understand benefit of the doubt. I'm sorry. Sorry, Kiwi Scoot, I don't quite get your question still. Yeah.
Let's see if I can steelman their question. I think she's referring to prescription marijuana, that if they're not impaired, then the benefit of the doubt can be given to them if they have a prescription, because they're following they're taking the prescribed amount given to them by the doctor. So do we need to do a lab test?
That would possibly be.
I think that would only kick in if they test the first oral test, the screening test was a positive, then they pull out and show their card to say I'm a medical user or whatever, and then what the Medical Cannabis Society is recommending would happen then is that there is a actual test for impairment that's a practical test rather than a body fluid test. So there would be some short roadside test. They said field test, meaning stand on one leg and follow my finger and all that kind of jazz. Where other people made submissions for MedPop that it should be some kind of a device that you can show that you're not impaired by, I don't know, doing puzzles or whatever. And so then if you were impaired on that device, then they would go to the second lab oral fluid test to show that it quantifies that the cannabis is there, the particular analytes that are impairing are there, and that it's over that level that would, or they'll go to a blood one under the previous amendment, but under the new amendment, they're trying to take away the right to the blood test when you really do need to get that blood confirmation, because the second oral fluid test will give a pretty good indication that you're over the limit in your blood, but it's not 100% again. So that is why if you failed that little extra test for impairment, a physical test, then it would move into getting stronger evidence from body fluids.
Okay, so
Yeah.
the test would be conducted if they showed signs of impairment. That's when you would do the oral swab test. Or you do the oral
No,
test first.
I'll do the test
then
first. Because
yep.
a lot of medical users may pass the oral fluid test.
Yep.
The oral fluid test is indicating that your levels are probably quite high. So then it would be a CIT to see if that's actually in reality causing you to be quite impaired. And then a second oral fluid and or blood test if you want to elect that, which they're trying to take away that right to the blood test. Yeah.
Let's say I come up to a road stop test, right? Roadside test, and I go, look, hey, I take prescription marijuana. Here's my card. You know, do I still have to do a second test? They can do a first test to see how much is in my system, but do I have to do a lab test if I don't show any physical signs of being impaired?
This is what the debate is over. Do we say to
Yep.
officers, you can use discretion, so you can just quickly look at them and go, oh, I think they look impaired or don't look impaired? Or do we ask the officers to apply some kind of practical test, like a field test on the road, where they're testing people's balance, whether they can walk a straight line, or do some other test like using a device that the Alertometer or the Druid app? And from that result, if they pass that, then the officers say, look, you're not impaired, you're a medical user, off you go, I'm not going to carry on doing more tests. So the debate here is, if we're going to change the testing regime to protect medical cannabis users, what's the framework for that? So they're not... Yeah, so there was a few...
Sorry,
I recommend going and reading the submissions from them and from... just having a look for the name. There was another lady that... She was a medical cannabis user and she spoke and she was really good. I can't find her name, sorry.
No, that's and thank you. I will look at that.
Yeah,
yes.
People are proposing a few extra protections anyway, so for medical cannabis users, and they have different ideas have been thrown around. Yeah.
Yeah, and for those who are wondering, this is the sort of place you have these sorts of debates, is at select committee, because that's when the public actually puts them in. You put out the ideas, then the committee goes through and evaluate the ideas, and it recommends the changes from what the building bill was at first reading before it gets sent off to second reading. Just for those who are thinking whether it's a done deal in the law or not, it is the process of how our parliamentary system is meant to work, which is the public submission aspect.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I'd have to do is, because it is an interesting discussion, and it is one I want to be accurate on, but it'd be interesting to see how much THC needs to be in your system versus how much of that causes noticeable impairment to driving, and whether or not there can be a balance struck up between the two in testing. I'd have to see what the averages are, because I think that would probably be the fairest way to do oral testing. I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah, I'd have to look at the stats for that.